Welcome to Thinking Nation series, Thinking Historically, where we connect students to scholars in their research as they explore historical topics and arguments in their classes. Today, we are thinking historically with Dr. Pearl Young, Assistant Professor of History and affiliated faculty member in the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. Dr. Young, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So students engaging in this unit are asked to compare and contrast the experiences of women on the home front during the Civil War. So to start, I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Young, how you might approach a prompt like this.
Yes, I always, when looking at prompts like this, want to look at kind of the different sections of the question. So this question is asking you to do a compare and contrast, which means you're going to be looking for both similarities and differences. It's specifically asking you about the experiences of women. So you want to be thinking about women as a category. So all these documents are written by women. So there's a commonality there. They're all written by women, but these women are not interchangeable. They have their differences between them, so also something to keep track of. It specifically asks you about women on the home front. So be thinking about what does the home front mean and what is women's place relative to that. And then it's asking you for a specific time period, so during the Civil War. So you're going to be thinking about women and the home front during that specific time period. So one of the things you want to pay attention to is the dates for the individual documents. So thinking about your broader knowledge of the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, where does a particular document fit in that timeline? And does that inform kind of your similarities and differences that you're keeping track
Could you help us kind of separate, I guess, the war from the home front in a way? Like maybe like what does the prompt mean by the home front?
Yeah, so typically when military historians think about war, they're thinking about events that take place either on the battlefield or in a strategy room that's like a little bit off-site from gunfire, but still close to the battlefield. So we're thinking about soldiers and generals and cannons and guns and so forth on the battlefront. And then, whatever the diplomats and the generals and maybe the president is kind of strategizing behind the scenes of what they're trying to take over, how they're going to fight this battle. So that's the battlefront, and then, like I said, the strategy discussions. In contrast to that, we have something else that we call the home front, which is people who are not on the battlefield and they're not in those war strategy rooms. They're at home, um, but they're still somehow involved in war. So it's important to remember that warfare takes place beyond the battlefield and beyond those strategy rooms. Warfare always involves civilians in one way or another. You cannot have a war without the entire society participating in it. Sometimes that's financially, you're being taxed to pay for the war. Sometimes that means fewer things are accessible to you. So maybe supply lines are disrupted. You don't have access to food or fancy appliances. It's hard to get things shipped to you. A lot of times it means people that you know leave the home front to go to the battlefront. So somebody enlists in the military and they're no longer in your household. So whatever tasks they used to contribute to your household now have to be taken up by other people. So if somebody was um, the primary breadwinner bringing in the income for the family. Now that might need to be supplemented by someone else. If somebody was mowing your lawn, but now they're in the military, either your lawn's not going to get mowed or somebody else has to mow the lawn. So it's going to affect the civilians who are not on the battlefield and perhaps aren't as invested in the outcome. But then also, nations go to war because there are conflicts about issues that interest them. So in the Civil War, there's a question about slavery. There's a question about power differential between the federal government and the state government. So civilians are invested in those conflicts as well. Um, a home in the South is going to be impacted over the question of whether or not slavery is going to continue to exist. Um, so those people who are civilians who live, in their home and they're not seeing battle every day, um, the war will necessarily have an impact on them. And then the reason this question asks you to focus on women, particularly in the 19th century, women were excluded from the war front or the battlefront. Women are not eligible to enlist in the military. They're not in wartime strategy rooms. They're not serving as president or general. And a lot of times women didn't have access to the vote either. So they're not in the political discussions. Um, and so women are traditionally marginalized to the home front. And oftentimes that means people just assume that women play no role in a war or that war doesn't affect women. But as I said, it's going to affect everyone in society naturally, and it can affect women's experience in particular ways that are unique to women. So, for example, if you have a lot of men that are out at war, it's more difficult to get married because
Hmm.
your potential spouse or a boyfriend that you might be dating is now not in town. He's off at war and he's not going to come home from war just to have a wedding and then go back out. So that has an impact on women's day to day experiences. But that's unique to women because the majority of men are making decisions about warfare and it doesn't have quite the same impact as it does on women.
Within this topic of women's experience during the Civil War, do you have like a go-to resource, primary source, story?
Um, yeah, I think one of the documents, I think it's document C, is a set of illustrations that look at Southern women and what's been referred to as the bread riots. And I think those can be really useful to just think about the ways in which the war affects women, even though they're not on the home front. So there's two images there. Um, the image on the left looks at women sending off loved ones to war. So you see in the same image, you see these women and you see soldiers. So they're not on the battlefront, but the war is kind of coming to them and they have those connections. Those women are going to continue to interact with their soldiers through letters and requests and so forth throughout the war. So you can kind of see that in that picture. And then the picture next to it looks at bread riots, where you have Southern women who are breaking into bakeries to try to steal food to feed their families. There's a common misconception that women are not violent and that all violence in war takes place on the battlefield. So here's a really good image that depicts the violence that these women are willing to engage in because of the level of desperation. And then the other really cool thing about these images is to think about how the Civil War is experienced by persons who are illiterate or semi literate. So this comes from an illustrated newspaper, which is much more common in the 19th century than 20th century. That's partly because it reaches a broader audience. You don't have to know how to read in order to look at these images. So that's going to reach poor whites who may not be able to read very well. It's also going to reach enslaved persons who are not allowed to know how to read. So it's a way to kind of see the sentiment that's being experienced by the more literate or sophisticated classes and what they want people to know about the war. So it's very deliberate that they're showing these wealthy white women engage in these various activities because they want to make people feel like that's a universal experience. Um, so I definitely would draw your attention to those images, both thinking about what they depict, but also kind of why they were created and who they're going to be used by.
I think that that contextualization of the um, visual document of the document set will be really helpful. I'd like to shift from within that document set to beyond it, and I'm curious if you have a particular primary source that isn't captured in this a unit that really highlights the experience of women on the home front.
Yeah, so I think one of the other places, there are obviously a lot of documents that you can look at, but one set of documents that might be useful is to look at the papers of Clara Barton, in particular her letters to her older brother David in 1862. So she talks about her decision to leave the home front and join the Union Army as a nurse. So you can see that in this letter here. She talks about it as this kind of very urgent matter. And then if you go to the next image, it is shortly thereafter where she's writing to him, encouraging him to accept his own position in the US military to work as a quartermaster, somebody who was going to be present on the battlefield but was primarily responsible for dealing with supplies for a particular unit. And you can see the extent to which she uses her position as this caring younger sister to really encourage her the country. So it's kind of patriotic position. So you have this woman who was on the home front. She herself migrates to the battlefield, but continues to kind of defer to the traditional idea that that's where men belong, and really using her position as a woman to encourage and support her family members to continue to be the American citizen that she wants them to be.
So if I think about that, you know, those letters in context of kind of the documents that students are looking at, I see some similarities in how the Confederate women were, I guess, encouraging Southern men to go fight for the Confederacy as kind of their duty to the South, and seems like that's what Clara Barton's doing for her brother, and
Right.
sounds like more than just her family. Um, what what do you see within the Clara Barton letters of like her own experience that maybe that type of experience isn't necessarily captured in the four documents students look at?
Yeah, so I think that in this particular document, this is a woman who decided to leave the home front and go engage in the battlefront and to put herself kind of in harm's way where there are guns and cannons and there's a lot of danger and to engage in that, whereas these other four women are other four sets of women are really comfortable with staying home and making their opinions and thoughts known from
Mm.
the home front. And so I think it's really easy to look at these four documents that we already have and make a generalization that women are excluded from the battlefront because that's tradition and that's the documents that we have. But there were ways for women to cross that boundary and to do it in ways that fit within the social norm. We do have examples and documented examples of women who joined the military dressed as men. So they're really kind of downplaying their femininity, but Clara Barton's an example of a woman who embraces her femininity and sort of uh, moves from the home front into the battlefield. Um, so I think it's certainly not for everyone, but it kind of gives you a broader context. And when you're making arguments, you want to be careful that you're not overgeneralizing. So you never want to say, all women did XYZ, you can say most women or these women that I'm
Right.
studying
Yep.
do whatever. And so that way it's a persuasive argument. We know you have evidence for it and you have the basis to make that argument, but you're not uh, stepping outside the bounds and making a broad claim that can't possibly be true.
Yeah, that's a feedback we often give uh, to students in their essays is, try to incorporate more, conditional language, right? That not to be so absolute, knowing that there's nuance and complexity in the
And I
past.
think that's an important
That's really helpful to
Yeah,
know.
it's an important part of being a historian is recognizing that there's complexity and nuance. And I think the tendency is to recognize complexity and then be afraid to make an argument because your argument might be wrong. I think it's important to be able to make the distinction. I can be confident in making a statement, but it's based on the evidence I have. So many women, or the women in these documents, show these similar characteristics. And then you've kind of protected yourself from overgeneralizing, but you've also assured the reader that you have confidence in your argument because you have evidence to back it up. And that's the most that we can ask for.
So to end our interview, I would love to hear what drew you to this particular era and area of study.
Yes, thank you. So I am originally a California girl. I moved to the American South when I was 10, and very much felt out of place there. But my grandmother and I liked just kind of exploring the local landscape and trying to learn a little bit more about this new place that we lived. So one of the things we started doing was visiting historic sites in the area. And so when I decided to become a historian, I think kind of that practical side of me just wanted to learn local history or regional history, um, and kind of continue what I had been doing with my grandmother and like a more academic. So I ended up going to school in the South, in the American South. So I continued to study the American South. And 19th century is just a great time period to study. There are a lot who are literate. There are a lot of written records, particularly because people moved so often from close family members or were separated for business or because of war or whatnot. So there's a lot of correspondence that has survived. And then it's far enough in the past that there's some distance between the time period I study and the present. So that also makes it nice. So I think the combination of those three, of the kind of learning about the place I'm living in, um, studying a time period for which there's so much documentation, and also this idea that's, it's really in the past, and there's a way I can kind of distinguish between what I'm studying and what I'm living. So I just got really fascinated by that. I've always been really fascinated by the connection between social norms and politics and the economy. So thinking about what people believe, or what society's expectations are of individuals, and then thinking about how that influences events that happened. So, in this case, thinking about women during the Civil War time period, not just what was happening, but is there an element of gender or regional norms that's playing into these larger political trends that seem very impersonal?
Dr. Young, thank you so much for spending time with us, thinking historically about women's experience during the Civil War. And I'm really excited for students to continue to engage in this topic through the unit.
Thanks for having me.